Well, I think we'll have the barn ready for church not a day too soon. Worship services like this.
Hallelujah.
God. I noticed while I was gone, we had a subversive group in the church. The pastor only been gone a few days, and they're tearing the church's foundation apart already. That was literally true, yes. Well, the first thing we want to look at this morning is biblical literature, and then we have some things to share with you in Christian Ethics series again. We're looking at the 19th century translations, revision work, and we come then to number 14 this morning. Last week we studied really a couple of hours on number 13, whose date was 1871, looking at John Nelson Darby and his systemization of what has become known as pre-tribulationism. And we spent a lot of time on that because of the places where it touches home in other areas. Now, we don't have a lot to say about number 14. The date is 1 year later, 1872. The title of the big mammoth work, this Bible, is the Emphasized Bible by Joseph Bryant Rotherham. Rotherham. I weighed it. It is big. It weighs 4 pounds and 8 ounces. It is a pronounced emphasized Bible. Joseph Rotherham, R-O-T-H-E-R, Rotherham, H-A-M. It's a very strange work. It's a unique Bible. I guess the name tells you why. It's much like Robert Young's. Remember Young's literal translation? In that it strives to be very literal. It's a very literal translation. But it's different than Young's because its literalness is seen in and this is like number 12, the Englishman's Bible by Thomas Newberry, because of a complex system of symbols, which is supposed to inform the reader where stress pronunciation is located, where it's minor, where it's heavy, emphasized, pronounced, the verbs and their tenses in Hebrew and Greek and all of this. Let me see if I can turn to some of the signs, and I'll pass it around here for you in a moment. For instance, you'll see a whole lot of these in the work. You'll have a phrase like, well, let me just find one. And get in a portion, Ruth, that ought to be easy enough. Okay, you take like Ruth 1. Well, the first few verses there, you have X number of words between two vertical lines. And it's got a word here, word. Two vertical lines, one on the left, one on the right, enclosing, not parentheses, but like a parenthesis, enclosing this phrase means light stress. The Hebrew would be light stress because of whatever the Hebrew is there. You double the line, we're talking about heavy stress. Or another way of showing a different type of heavy stress is, cancel these lines and give us these greater than and less than signs. And just goes on and on and on. But these are the chief ones that you find just throughout this volume. It was originally, the New Testament came out first in 1872, which is a date that I've given you. That's just for the New Testament. The Old Testament came out from 1897 through 1902. 1897 through 1902. It is all based on the new textual theories and studies which have just arisen in the decades just preceding the publication of this, particularly those by Tregillis, Westcott, and Hort. It was republished in recent times by Kriegel Publications, Grand Rapids, Michigan, in 1959. That was an important date in world history, by the way. 1959. Some of you are thinking about it. And I'll let you figure on that the rest of the message this morning. You'll be asking your neighbor. 50 years. Then we've got, yes, that was the year famous people were born. Then it's been reprinted several times, all the way up into the 80s. I didn't check to see, what my edition is. A few other notes about it. We're not going to spend a lot of time here. Suffice it to say, it's a very literal Bible, literal translation, striving to give us the stress of Greek and Hebrew, grammar. At the end of the Old Testament, they have what they call a special note, or Rotherham has a special note on the Apocrypha, which is interesting. And then he has an appendix. One follows the Old Testament and one follows the New. I just wanted to pick out a few things from the appendix in the New, particularly to read some to you. But from the Old, here are some of the topics. And I didn't know these were back here until I got into this recently, and we're looking at all of the table of contents. And you got some very detailed, scholarly information back here that I was surprised to find. It's all in, I think, alphabetical order. First of all, for the Old Testament, you've got a section. Here's what it looks like. And here's your note on the Apocrypha. Here's your appendix. And this first one here, the authorship of Deuteronomy. And he does believe in Mosaic authorship, but he deals with the critical theories. Then the next thing is the scapegoat. The so-called, which is a transliteration of the Hebrew, Azazel, A-Z-A-Z-E-L. What exactly does that mean? Sometimes you've got it in the KJV as Azazel in the margin, a scapegoat in the text, and so forth. What does Azazel mean? He has a note on that, rather short. He's got a very lengthy note on the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, book of Exodus. The question is often phrased something like this: who hardened Pharaoh's heart? Did Pharaoh harden his own heart, or did God harden Pharaoh's heart? It's a question of theology, but of course it affects practical living as well. The next to last note, which is the next one in order here, is the propitiatory offering, the so-called atonement question of the Old Testament. And then the last question is the sin offering, sin bearer question. And I find this to be very interesting. What he points out here, and most people who've studied, I guess, recognize this, that there's no difference in Hebrew between the words for sin and sin offering, or the words for guilt and guilt offering. You have to interpret on the basis of the context. Now, if it said that David blanked, it didn't say David sin offeringed. Well, David sinned. But if David offered a blank, it wouldn't be David offered a sin, he offered a sin offering. The context would tell you. There's only one Hebrew word for that. Well, of course, where this would interest folks like ourselves would be in this passage, 2 Corinthians 5:21. For he hath made him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. And Dr. Freeman, later in his position, and I've seen this elsewhere, came to the conclusion that since there is no difference, and of course that's Greek, of course, in the New Testament, but it's based on the Old. The sin offering and the sin concept is a Hebrew, Semitic Old Testament concept. And since there is no difference between the terms for sin and sin offering, then we should better translate 2 Corinthians 5:21 as, for he hath made him to be a sin offering for us. You rule out this problem, or any associations or questions of the problem of Jesus and spiritual death. Well, he is critical of that interpretation of 2 Corinthians 5:21, and I believe rightfully so. Let me see what he has to say. He mentions 2 Corinthians 5:21, all right, the next sentence after the mentioning of that. The translator is pleased on reviewing the three editions of his New Testament to see that he has hitherto resisted the temptation to substitute sin offering for sin in the passage, and he traces it to the influence over him of this remarkable usage in Leviticus. What remarkable usage? Well, he's been discussing here for, probably 50 or 60 lines of type text here. So I found that to be interesting. You've got a note of all places in the middle of Rotherham's Bible that could touch home with this JDS question. Dr. Freeman, as I say, came to that later, and I've seen that in other commentaries. Some of them say that could be translated sin offering, but I think I can prove to you grammatically that that's not appropriate. It cannot be done that way in 2 Corinthians 5:21, that it has to be left sin there and cannot be translated sin offering. Then at the end of the New Testament, it was much longer. The articles are generally a little shorter, but there are many more of them. For instance, number 1, they're all in alphabetical order, is the abyss. What does the abyss mean? A-B-Y-S-S in the New Testament. And down in Boston this weekend, we had this word came up as an interesting word for, of all things, this question of Jesus descending into hell and his spiritual death in Romans chapter 10 and verse 7. You know, don't say who can ascend to heaven to bring Christ down from above, or don't say who shall descend into the abyss to bring up Christ again from the dead, because the word of faith is nigh you. Anyway, age, listen to this. The third article back in the back is this. Age remind you of young, age abiding. And now listen to what he has to say on this. This is very good. I was surprised to find all this theology packed in the back of Rotherham's Bible. From what you know of what we've said about ion and acetone, iona, and there's no Greek word for eternity, but you get the preposition and accusative and so forth. Okay, age abiding. Now that is lasting for an indefinite or perpetual age, or abiding from age to age. The reasons for adopting this rendering of the Greek adjective ionios are, number one, to keep up a close, I'll get to the important thing in just a moment, I've got to read the background, to keep up a close connection with the word age as the translation in this New Testament of the cognate noun ion, or eon. And number two, to avoid, as too restricted, the confinement of the idea to any particular limited age. It is true that ion, or eon, as we would pronounce it, Englishmen, does not of itself mean absolute eternity. He said eon doesn't mean that. It just means age. It could mean eternity, depending on how you construe the sentence and make perhaps some other words near it. It does not itself mean absolute eternity. Otherwise, it would not submit to be multiplied by itself, as in the familiar phrase, eons of eons, which would then be equivalent to eternities of eternities. And it is further true that in the history of divine revelation, eon sometimes puts a dispensational limit upon itself, so forth. But with all this, it is most important to remember that age is not the primary meaning of ion or eon. Rather, duration indefinitely extended. Moreover, it seems to be as clothed with this more primitive significance that the qualifying word ionios comes into use. The noun ion itself clings to this fundamental notion in the well-known, listen to this, in the well-known idiomatic phrase, eis ton iona, literally being translated into or unto the age, in the interpretation of which, if the force of the idiom be ignored and each word be pressed on its own individual merits, the reader will be continually teased by feeling that he is being referred to some particular and preeminent age which ought to be well known, while all the time it is unknown. He may then say, unto the age, yes, but unto what age? So he said, you've got to bear witness to the idiom that's found there, that it's not saying age, it's saying eternity. So I thought that was interesting. It's a rather technical discussion, but I think he's right. Then he has one on assembly, said that it shouldn't be church in the New Testament because it just carries too many awkward connotations to it, but it should be assembly. Baptism, Beelzebul, Christ, which he deals with that anointed business, and I've dealt with that in ITP recently. We're coming across Paul preaching, saying, this is the Christ. Well, that'd mean nothing to a Jew. He's saying, this is Mashiach. This is the anointed one. Covenant, it's the old argument about diatheke, demon, evil one, Gehenna. Glad message, he said there's really no word in English to translate euangelion, and he's probably right there. Hades, immersion, Jesus, judge, kingdom, no, mammon. The end of Mark's gospel, real short paragraph on that. Messenger, mystery, presence, rest, Sabbath, sacred secret, shepherd, shrine, soul, spirit, spirit versus ghost, in the translation of Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit, temple, tent, torch, and virginity. So it's very interesting. I'll have to remember that a lot of this information is back there. So I think I'll send this around with it open to Psalm 51, since that's a well-known psalm, and just notice all the various marks. We're not going to spend a lot of time looking at how he translates. This is his own translation too, by the way. How he translates and all of that, because you can just go forever on any individual translation, but you can take a look at it. Now, the place where let me make this comment first. You say, well, what's the worth of this Bible? Well, to me, it appears to be an okay translation. It's very literal. So you'd be using it with that as a purpose in mind. You wanted something that was extremely literal. It takes a while. I'm not accustomed. It's not one that I use a lot. I've looked things up in it, to be sure. But it takes a while, as with any Bible with symbols, to get accustomed to those symbols and trying to memorize all those. You got to keep turning back to the beginning to find out what am I being told by the use of X symbol here in this passage. I do not see it in my readings of scholarly works. I do not see it being quoted or used hardly at all. I have seen it over the years maybe once or twice. So I guess that's the scholarly opinion of Rotherham's translation. But I don't find a big fault with it. When I read his appendix, I see good theology, and I agree with his arguments, linguistic arguments on a lot of these Hebrew and Greek terms. However, and I don't mean this to be ironic or humorous, it may turn out that way, but in this recently published book, Speaking in Other Tongues, A Scholarly Defense, this is a translation they really defend. Now, I've told you some about this book before. In a section entitled Special Notes, pages 13 to 15, they are cluing you in on what their symbols are in this book and what they mean by terms and by definition and so forth. Then, like the term charismatic, what do they mean whenever they use the term? And it's good when a writer does that, because, you're charismatic and so is John F. Kennedy, but there's a big difference between how we're using the term there. A big difference. And there are charismatics who are charismatics, and then there are what I call non-charismatic charismatics, who really don't believe in all the charismatic doctrine. And then we've got a lot of people who call themselves charismatic, but who don't speak in tongues, who don't believe it's a sign of being charismatic. How can you be charismatic and not speak in tongues? So everybody uses the word with their own definition. So it's good when a writer will tell you, this is how I'm using the word. Be ye right or wrong. This is how I'm using it. So you can read the book, and it makes some sense to you. And it's got a section entitled, page 14, Translations Quoted. KJV, that's the primary one. Most are from the KJV. Then he gives the other well-known ones, ASV, New American Standard, New International Version, the Revised Standard Version, and then separated from this business of translations, a special note on two other translations. One, Rotherham. And here's what he says. Scripture references designated Rotherham are from the Emphasized Bible by Joseph Bryant Rotherham, an extremely accurate translator. The Christian Commonwealth, it's a Christian publication and magazine, called him, quote, the most ambitious of literalists, end of quote. Even better, more so than Young, they're saying. And then his other translation that he separates is Wiest. That's, of course, Kenneth Wiest for the New Testament. Scripture references designated Wiest are from the New Testament, an expanded translation by Kenneth Wiest, author of Wiest Word Studies from the Greek New Testament. And we'll study Wiest's translation, which is just of the New Testament, later in our class here. So this is where I have seen it, in this newly published book by Barnett and McGregor, Speaking in Other Tongues, A Scholarly Defense. They do enjoy Rotherham. Okay, any questions on that? If not, we're going to go on to something else here. I don't recommend that you run out and buy it, but I have found use for it over the years. I haven't had it that long, last few years, maybe 2 or 3 years. Okay, number 15, just one sentence, then we'll be on to something else. A work published in 1885, number 15, 1885, entitled A Translation of the Old Testament Scriptures from the Original Hebrew. I'll take a drink of water while you write that title down. A translation from the Old Testament, of the Old Testament Scriptures from the original Hebrew by, our first time we've seen this, a woman, Helen, one or two L's? Two L's. Helen Spurrell, which was based on an unpointed text. And there's really nothing more I need to say about that. Now, we are still in the 19th century. As you can see, we're moving way into the latter quarter of the 19th century. And I think we'll then start on number 16, which will take us several weeks to finish number 16. So we're through just kind of running all the way through all of these centuries, one after another, a sentence or two, or maybe an entire morning spent on a translation or two. We're through doing that, and we come to one more important translation, the last one we're going to look at, by the way, in the 19th century. Whenever we are through with this, then the date will be 1901, and we'll start with the translations of this modern century, the 20th century. Now, if you remember in our past studies over the last few months now, we have seen nothing substantial, including this morning. We have seen that nothing substantial happens in English Bible translation from the year 1611 to the time right now, let's say the mid-ninth decade of the 19th century, a period of 250 years, from 1611 to, let's say, 1885. We've seen nothing substantial happen. We've seen all of these various small, private, they began as private, paraphrased revisions of the KJV, oftentimes of nothing more than the New Testament. Sometimes nothing more than perhaps the Gospels, Book of Acts, or Paul's epistles, one or the other of the above. But we've seen nothing really great or substantial or lasting take place. Well, we finally, at this point this morning, come to our next big work in English Bible translation, and that is the work that most often, I'm going to have to explain this, I'm going to call it by something else to keep confusion out of our midst, most often is called the RV. The RV. Now, I'm not going to call it the RV because what that stands for is the revised version. You can figure that out in a hurry. Everything, it seems to be revised. And that's because of the great popularity and the greater importance attached to the RSV, the revised version that's standard, the revised standard version. It's too easy, I think, for maybe a lot of you to confuse this in your mind. So, and besides, the RV was step one in a process. The RV was step one in a process, was step one on the other side of the Atlantic, from a process that was to later include, it sort of began to include, and then later it did include, something that happened on the soil in North America. So what we're going to call this, and it can be properly called this, the ERV. If I get enough letters in here and I get one that's different, E, from this S, and it starts with E rather than being in the middle of RV, then I hope that we can keep these distinguished. That, of course, would then stand for the English Revised Version. The English Revised Version. Now, I didn't copy this from this book. This was my own design. But in their list of translations, they give you the KJV, ASV, NAS, which really is not correct. You lost a letter on the end of that. NIV, RSV, and look at this last one, the ERV. This is our designation for the revised version of 1885, the English revision of the KJV. In quotations of Bible commentaries, revised as a word, R-E-V, period, or capital RV, as I've given it to you, all refer to this English revision of the KJV. So they came up with the same idea, and I think it was to make sure that people don't confuse these two translations. You understand what I'm saying? The English Revised Version. To get ahead of myself, there's an ASV that, for sake of agreement, I guess it really should be the ARV, the American Revised Version. But, a strange thing, we don't have the R, we have the S instead, and that's part 2 here, the ASV. American, A. British, English, E. So if we can attach this letter, that's another reason I attach E on here, to keep it in the same family as this translation, because these are cousins of one another, the ERV and the ASV. As you'll see, the ASV will be the next thing we discuss. So for 250 years now, well, over 250 years, I guess, nothing substantial happens. 250 years. That's many lifetimes. That's 2.5 centuries. Many score years. From 1611 to 1885, you can fit 1, 2, 3, all these translations over the last month or so that we've been looking at. All small things that are not very important. A few of them, like Young's, like Rotherham's, were important enough to still be in print today, or let's say it another way, to have been reprinted in modern times. But even those are not really used. The next important translation, this is an important thing to remember, after the KJV, is the ERV, the English Revised Version. Now, a few months earlier, we looked at some of the changes that took place during this period of 250 years. Such as a better knowledge of the biblical languages and so forth. Most importantly, we looked at the subject of the availability or the discovery, or the better, earlier manuscripts that are now available. So from the year 1850, midway through this century, from 1850 onward, the demand in Europe for a new, fresh translation, which, however, was to be a revision of the KJV, the demand for a new translation became increasingly strong. This is because of all the textual theories which have arisen, all the textual studies, new manuscripts discovered, better understanding of Hebrew idiom, and so forth. Comparative linguistics on the rise during this time, and so forth. So from 1850 onward, people are recognizing all these little words here are not enough. We need a formal, recognized, universal, important revision of the KJV. Now, before I even get any further with that, and I'll come back and say that statement again in just a moment, let me show you. About a year ago, when I was living down in Boston, one of you in the church sent me a cartoon that I'd seen elsewhere of an old, tired, disgruntled, disheveled scribe who makes a statement. I'll have to show you a picture of what he looks like so you can get it all. You mean you want the revised revision of the original revised revision revised? Well, it's a critique against Bible translating work. So I thought this was pretty interesting. I've seen it elsewhere. You mean you want the revised revision? We're talking about the RV, the ERV, the revised revision, the revised version. The revised revision of the original revised revision revised. See if you understand what he's saying here. You want the revised revision of the original revised revision revised. You want the revised revision of the original revised revision of the original work revised. So I guess it would look like this in order. A, B, C, right? This would be first, this would be second, and this would be third. But let's just see how many translations we're really talking about here. All right, you want the revised revision of the revised revision. Well, to start with, we've got to have a work, a translation. Then a revision of it. The revised revision, the revision of it. Then the revised revision of the work, which would be number one, right? All right, you want the revised revision of that. So you want the revision of that, then you want the revised revision of that. And then you want all of this revised. And see, that's pretty much what we've seen. Everybody's revising something. The KJV isn't really the original. It's revising this, which was a revision of that, which was a revision of that, which was, just go back and back and back. So this is a very good, a humorous to be sure, but a very good way of explaining it. You mean you want the revised revision of the original revised revision revised. That's how many translations, if you understand what I'm saying here, you get out of a statement like that. The common fellow sees that and laughs and throws it in the garbage can. And I look at it, or you would look at it and think, well, now let's get all this out. Now where does Tyndale fit in here? And where does Wycliffe, and where does the KJV and the Geneva's Bible fit in here? So there are all the translations, 6 translations. You get out of this one humorous illustration. Okay. That was my one joke for this morning. Now, back to, I don't promise you that. Back to what I was saying. From 1850 onward, there's an increasing demand for new translation. But, as always, some people are not open to change. We call them brontosaurs. They're not open to change. Let me give you a couple of examples of the flavor of the time on both sides of the issue. Those not in favor of change, and later those in favor of change. And you'll find the same thing today with people who want to, let's say, revise the KJV again for the umpteenth time. And the KJV is basically, of course, William Tyndale, as we all know. You find people who are in favor of it and people who aren't in favor of it, and for different reasons. Some with superstitious reasons. If it was good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me. They wouldn't want it revised. Others of us would say, as I read from a recent scholarly work that I brought here, we think there are enough Bible translations. We're wasting our time, we're wasting our money, we're wasting the church's energies to go on until doomsday, retranslating. Get a Bible, settle with it, and start living what you're reading there. Enough of the scholarly business of translating the revised revision of something that was the revised revision of a revised revision of the original. Just get a word and live it. So here are some examples. Number one, a man by the name of H.J. Todd. T-O-D-D. H.J. Todd. Published two works. Number one, a vindication of the AV. Now remember, AV, that's the English abbreviation. The American, or I should say British, the American is KJV. The English, or the British, is AV, Authorized Version. Vindication of the AV, 1819. Well, you can tell by the title that he wasn't in favor of any new work being done on the KJV. And a second work that Todd published was this, Remarks upon the Critical Principles. Now, how do you think we could describe his remarks? Well, they would certainly be critical. Remarks upon the Critical Principles, published in 1820. This work has been called, and I quote, the most masterly manifesto against change. See, I'm giving you references to those who say the KJV is good enough, we don't need a new work. It has been called, I quote, the most masterly manifesto against change. This was, I guess, a century for manifestos, like the better-known one, the Communist Manifesto. The most masterly manifesto against change. So there's Todd. Second example, R.C. Trench. Last name just like it sounds, Trench, R.C. Trench. Published a work entitled On the AV. On the AV. He was somewhat more charitable than Todd in that he said change was inevitable, but perhaps this was not the right time to do it. Wait until another generation. This was mid-1800s. And he, I guess, was more or less right. They did wait until one more generation. And a third example, just to give you a flavor of the times, there were people, in other words, who were very much opposed, at least to start with, some of them, as we shall see, to this ERV project. A third example is E.H. Plumter. P-L-U-M-P-T-R-E. E.H. Plumter. Writing in the revised edition, sorry for that, folks, but the revised edition of William Smith's Bible Dictionary. By the way, Smith's Bible Dictionary is still in print today. I have a copy of it, a modern copy of it. It first came out in 1870. It's not one that I would recommend. Smith's Bible Dictionary does have some liberal slant to it in places. But Plumter, writing in the revised edition of William Smith's Bible Dictionary, it's a little small thing. It looks like Halley's Handbook. It's a small thing. He had several things to say. He said, change must come, but, I quote, as little change as possible should be made in the language of the AV. In other words, why do the work If your whole argument is, well, we want to keep the AV the way that it is. We can make change, but make as little change as possible. It's one comment of his in one of the early editions of Smith's Bible Dictionary. E.H. Plumter also said that we should be critical of what he called, I quote, the emasculated elegance of the 18th century works. Remember what we said about the KJV. As far as pure literary force is concerned, nothing has ever or will ever supplant the KJV. So he was very critical of what he called the emasculated elegance. In other words, no elegance. You don't have any beauty. It's all ugly. Of the 18th century works. Probably referring to such works as Edward Harwood's liberal, not literal, as Young's, Harwood's liberal translation. We have covered that earlier. But he was critical. In other words, he's saying we might have better critical or textual principles to follow today. But in translating the work, we're going to end up with a Bible that is inferior to the KJV because of the lack of literary beauty and quality, the emasculated elegance of the 18th century works. He favored dropping the chapter summaries and page headings, which have been in different editions depending on who the publisher is of the KJV over the last few centuries. He favored dropping the chapter summaries and page headings because they could be and sometimes were interpretive. And we have seen this to be true. We have seen covenant theology in the page headings in places such as the book of Isaiah, where anything, it always says, God's love for his church. They're interpreting the church as being the new Israel today, spiritual Israel. They're always calling Israel in Isaiah the church. Not in my Bible, though. Mine is the corrected Ross edition of the KJV. I have that marked out, and I put Israel in. He's talking to Israel, not the church, because the church isn't spiritual Israel. You can't find a shred of support for that in the Word of God. It's interesting to note, however, that these last two men I've just mentioned, Trench and Plumter, end up as committee members on the ERV work. So they had their minds changed later, but they started off being somewhat opposed. But remember, not as much as Todd. Todd's work, his second one, the most masterly manifesto against change. Trench said change was inevitable in his work on the AV, but perhaps this was not the right time. And Plumter said, well, change, yes, but as little as possible. But both of the last two men I mentioned end up on the RV committee, or the ERV committee. If I slip and say RV, you know we're not talking about RSV. That's way up in the 1940s and 50s. We're talking about the ERV. Well, the other side of the coin would be those who are more ready for change, for an improvement of the KJV. Well, I gave you three negative ones. Let me give you three positive sources of people who are in favor of change. Number one, we have a man, some of these people aren't well known, H. Hallam. I give you him because he's an early reference. In his work entitled Literature of Europe, see his date is early, that's why I give him to you, 1839. 1839, and the work's not even going to, be thought about until up in the 1870s of the ERV. So he's very early. Literature of Europe, he is in favor of change. The KJV needs to be improved. Number two, in the Edinburgh Review of 1855. The Edinburgh Review, Scottish journal. In 1855, it's a publication of an article which was in favor of change. Then a third example, we get up into recent times, we get up into important names. J.B. Lightfoot. J.B. Lightfoot. In a work entitled On a Fresh Revision. On a Fresh Revision, 1871. He argued, Lightfoot, now is the time for a new work because Greek scholarship, I quote, has never stood higher. He was a New Testament scholar versus Old. Greek scholarship has never stood higher. He said that there were enough scholars to do the work and enough knowledge to see them through. Now, he had an unfounded fear of what might happen if he didn't start to work right away. And it seemed, I take a quote from page 188 of Lightfoot's On a Fresh Revision. He says the following: Greek scholarship has reached its height in England, and henceforth it may be expected to decline. I don't know why he had such a pessimistic outlook on the future of Greek scholarship. It's only increased over the years. It was an unfounded fear. But he felt now is the time, and part of his argument was because now is the zenith point, and we're going to go down in scholarship after this if we don't do something right now. Okay, there's a little introduction to the ERV. I got a little time left. I'm trying to put in as much as I can of these messages so we can complete biblical literature within the foreseeable future, the lifetimes of most of us. There's a little background information. That I'm being facetious. We'll finish next year, I hope. 1980. I shouldn't put "I hope" on there. That's a problem right away. We will finish in 1988. I think. Now, let's get right into the history of the ERV. On February the 10th, now we'll get more specific. February the 10th, the year was 1870. The man, Dr. Samuel Wilberforce, spelled just like it sounds, that's what his mother named him, Bishop of Winchester, submitted a motion to the upper house of convocation of the province of Canterbury. Wilberforce was an important force in the English church, let's say, in that period in English church history. He submitted a motion to the upper house of convocation of the province of Canterbury. Now, the other province, York, you see they're going to have a problem with Canterbury later. That's why I'm specifying this is the province of Canterbury. Which read, now I'm going to read this, but I'm not going to take the time for you to take it down word for word now. You can get it off the tape if you want. It is an important statement. It's the resolution, the initial resolution that's made, the motion that's submitted by Wilberforce that is the spark behind the eventual work of the ERV that's going to come forth in, let's say, a decade and a half. There will be one point in this statement that I want to draw your attention to, but I'll read it and it'll be on the tape if you want to take it down word for word. Here's the motion. That a committee of both houses, the upper and the lower house of convocation, that a committee of both houses be appointed with power to confer with any committee that may be appointed by the convocation of the northern province, which is York, the southern one is Canterbury, to report upon the desirableness of a revision. Now listen to this, see if you catch something strange in this. He was supposed to be a scholar, but someone else had to correct him later. To report upon the desirableness of a revision of the authorized version of the New Testament, whether by marginal notes or otherwise, in all those passages where plain and clear errors, whether in the Hebrew or Greek text originally adopted by the translators, or in the translation made from the same, shall on due investigation be found to exist. Do you notice anything strange in that statement, or was it too long and confusing to? Hebrew and Greek, he said he wants to revise the New Testament. And he said, whichever manuscripts you pick, whether the original Hebrew or the original Greek ones, that we want to do a revision on the basis of that. Well, that was quickly spotted by someone else. That's the stranger, I would say, in this motion here. A Hebrew New Testament? New Testament wasn't written in Hebrew. So another man present, Olivet, I guess that's his last name, Olivant, O-L-L-I-V-A-N-T, who was Bishop of Llandaff, quickly corrected it by, rather than dropping the word Hebrew, added the word Old. Old Testament. That's what gave us a complete Bible. Otherwise, from this one little slip, I mean, they're bound by their documents here unless they correct them. Otherwise, if we wouldn't have had that, we would have nothing but New Testament. They would have seen later the New Testament wasn't written in Hebrew, but Greek. So we would have ended up with only an ERVNT, just of the New Testament. So he said, Hebrew and Greek. Rather than dropping the word Hebrew, then that matches Greek New Testament. He leaves the word Hebrew and adds Old and New Testament. That's what gave us then, from the correction of Oliphant, of Wilberforce, the entire Bible. Okay, the next step along the way would be this. That was all kind of number 1 under the origins of the ERV. Now I'm on number 2. The upper house agreed to this motion with Oliphant's correction. That kind of makes you suspicious of the work to begin with if the scholars don't even know what the original languages were. The upper house agreed to this motion and sent it along to the lower house, which also agreed the following day, which would be what, February the 11th, just over 100 years ago. And this shows you denominationalism. Listen to these upper and lower houses and committees and subcommittees. Then the two houses, upper and lower house of convocation, set up a committee. You know what committees are for. They take minutes while wasting hours. They set up a committee to write the required report. You got to write a report before you can do anything about it. Then the northern province of York, that was in the motion put forward by Wilberforce, as you can get off the tape. The northern province of York agreed with the proposal of a revision, but it disagreed with the notion of working with the southern province of Canterbury. And so York was not to be included, because they wouldn't agree to work with the scholars from Canterbury. So Canterbury's committee was composed then of 7 bishops and 14 members of the lower house. This is a committee that was appointed by upper and lower house, Canterbury's committee. Of 7 bishops, 14 members of the lower class. They then submitted the report. That's why the two houses set this committee up, was to write the required report. They submitted the report on May the 3rd, 1870, with 5 resolutions, and I'm going to give you those resolutions. Those were to be kind of like the guidelines. We had like the 15 guidelines of the KJV. The 5 resolutions submitted in the report on May the 3rd, 1870. Okay, you up to date? Okay, let's start with these. A, resolution number 1. I'm going to read these so you can get them down as a direct quote, because most of them are pretty short. That it is desirable that a revision of the AV of the Holy Scriptures be undertaken. That it is desirable that a revision of the AV of the Holy Scriptures be undertaken. Key word in that being revision. This is going to be a revision, not a new translation, although we'll go back to Hebrew and Greek. It will be a revision of the KJV. B, that the revision be so conducted as to comprise both marginal renderings and such emendations. If you amend something. and such emendations as it may be found necessary to insert in the text of the AV. Go over it again. That the revision be so conducted as to comprise both marginal, that's one of the important words. I'll try to give you some of the important words in each one, what the thing is about. So when you look at this second resolution, you can just skim over it and see marginal. All right, it's going to include marginal readings in. Some Bibles don't have that. Marginal renderings and such emendations, there's a second important word to underline, as it may be found necessary to insert in the text of the AV. So you would want, if you want to know what this is about, you'd have marginal underlines, that stands out. You're going to have marginal readings. You're going to have emendations in the text underlined. So that's a change of marginal readings and an inclusion of marginal readings as well as a change of the text. We're going to amend the text if it be found necessary. C. This is a little bit longer, just by probably a few words. That in the above resolutions, we do not are the words to underline, we do not contemplate any new translation. New translation underline. In other words, what this third resolution is saying is what I've said before, it's not a new translation. That in the above resolutions we do not contemplate any new translation of the Bible. Or any alteration of the language. Or any alteration of the language except when in the judgment of the most competent scholars such change is necessary. Except when in the judgment of the most competent scholars such change is necessary. That in the above resolutions we do not contemplate any new translation of the Bible or any alteration of the language except when in the judgment of the most competent scholars such change is necessary. So the third one is saying this is not a new Bible. Letter D, resolution number 4. That in such necessary changes the style of the language, you can underline style of the language, when we do find something we need to change, that in such necessary changes the style of the language employed in the existing version be closely followed. The style of the language employed in the existing version, that is the AV, be closely followed. And you could underline the last word, follow the KJV style of language, when and if at all possible. So it's like the earlier man said, change is necessary, but let's change as little as possible. I'll read through that one more time. That in such necessary changes, the style of the language employed in the existing version be closely followed. And then resolution number 5, or letter E, this is the longest one, that it is desirable that convocation, capital C, that it is desirable that convocation, that's the official body, should nominate a body of its own members to undertake the work of revision. So you could underline something like convocation and own members. They're going to be the ones who actually do the work. Should nominate a body of its own members to undertake the work of revision, who shall be at liberty to invite the cooperation of any eminent for scholarship. And that sounds like the KJV, that we've got our committee members, but there are other, quote, learned divines, unquote, out there in the English world. You can invite their scholarship and expertise if you have need of it. Who shall be at liberty to invite the cooperation of any eminent, that's E-M, not I-double-M, eminent, E-M-I-N-E-N-T, eminent for scholarship, to whatever nation or religious body they may belong. That will be important, probably starting next Sunday morning. Now I'll go through that last one again. Then I've got one more point. We'll be through this morning. That it is desirable that convocation should nominate a body of its own members to undertake the work of revision, comma, who shall be at liberty to invite the cooperation of any eminent for scholarship, comma, to whatever nation or religious body they may belong. In other words, you could have people other than, English subjects of the throne or the crown in England, and people who are part of other religious bodies than the official church, the Anglican faith in England. And we'll see what this produces, maybe perhaps some of the problems and suspicions is produced next time. Now let me conclude with a third point then, and we'll be through with the origins of the ERV. This report, which I've just given you with its 5 resolutions, was accepted by both houses, upper and lower house of convocation, who then appointed a second committee. Here we go with these stupid committees. To clean up after the first committee. This is ridiculous. It's like they appoint committee 1 to brush their teeth, but then appoint a second committee to hold the toothbrush for them. This report was accepted by both houses, who then appoint a second committee to put flesh on the resolutions in the form of specific principles or guidelines which were to be followed for the revision work, as well as to start work on the new Bible. This committee then split in half into 2 committees. Well, they'd have to do that. An Old Testament one, which was to work on, you guessed it, the Old Testament, beginning with the Pentateuch, and see how things came out. The other half became the New Testament committee, which was to begin with the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew through Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew through Luke, and see how things came out. In other words, it wasn't just, well, we're just going to do it. It was, we're going to put our foot in the water and test the temperature first of all type of mentality. Work on the Pentateuch, you Old Testament scholars. Work on the Synoptic Gospels, you New Testament scholars, and we'll see how the work progresses, and then all the odds are saying we'll probably go ahead and do the work, which of course they did. Now, various sources contradict one another in the number of men originally meant to be on each of these committees. We saw that to be a problem with the KJV, that at the end of the day it's difficult to prove, and I don't know that it's very important, that we come up with exactly how many members and just who those people were. But the sources that I have researched contradict one another. Some say 18 members per committee. Some say 24 members per committee. Some say 27 members. Those are the 3 most frequently used numbers, 18, 24, and 27, as being the number of members per half committee, or per Old Testament, New Testament group. But I'll just say this, in the end we have more than 60 names. No one knows exactly how many, but in the end we have more than 60 names of eminent scholars employed in the work. That's really all we need to know. Then we've got about the same number for the KJV if you just want to round it off, 54, 57, 63, whatever. We've got 60 men, 50 men for the KJV and the ERV. The men are paid nothing for several decades of part-time work, like the KJV men. Remember, they weren't paid anything. They were given room and board. That's the same for ERV, but they're paid nothing. However, Oxford and Cambridge University presses, they're often just called the university presses, meaning those two schools, Oxford and Cambridge. The university presses took the burden of all financial costs, their food, their travel, where they had to be reimbursed and so forth. The two university presses of Oxford and Cambridge took the burden of all financial costs in exchange. You don't give anything free, not even in those days, in exchange for exclusive copyright privileges, which would only make sense. I mean, I'm not being critical of that procedure. But the two university presses took the burden off of the men and these committees and convocations and so forth of all financial costs in exchange for exclusive copyright privileges.